On July 24, 1943, west of the Bay of Biscay, off the coast of Spain, the German submarine U-459 was on the surface. At 5:15 p.m., a British Wellington bomber unexpectedly appeared overhead and immediately began an attack. Although the attack was sudden, the Germans quickly took up their combat stations and opened fire on the aircraft with their anti-aircraft guns. The Wellington sustained serious damage from the first shot, and the burning bomber descended at full speed and crashed into the submarine's starboard side. During the impact, the rear hemisphere housing the machine gun was turned off and fell into the water, taking with it the stern gunner, Sergeant Turner, who was the only remaining member of the aircraft's crew. The Germans also suffered losses as a result of the attack and the aircraft's impact. The submarine's crew ran onto the deck and began removing the aircraft's wreckage. The impact also caused extensive damage to the submarine's superstructure and light hull. On the deck, the submariners found several depth charges that had broken free from the aircraft's mounts and were now rolling across the deck. The submarine's commander, Corvette Captain Georg von Wilamowitz-Mollendorf, ordered the submarine to increase speed and jettison the charges. Despite the submarine's full speed, one of the depth charges exploded very close to the stern after being jettisoned, disabling the vertical rudder. 15 minutes after the first attack, a second Wellington appeared overhead. The bomber strafed the submarine with machine guns and dropped 7 depth charges. The explosions caused further damage to the submarine, and the situation became hopeless for the Germans. The commander ordered the remaining crew members to abandon the U-boat, remaining on the sinking submarine himself, which soon disappeared beneath the waves. A short time later, 41 German submariners and 1 British crew member from the Wellington were picked up by the Allied destroyers Iroquois and Orkan from Force W. The submarine involved in this battle was no ordinary German submarine. It was a so-called Milchkuh, or Type 14. Only 10 of these submarines were built during World War II. They had an unconventional design and performed an important task for the German wool packs in the Atlantic. They resupplied the U-boats with various supplies on the high seas, thereby allowing Donetsk steel sharks to operate a greater distance from their bases and intercept Allied convoys. It's believed that the history of the German Type 14 submarine began during World War II, and this is true, but the prerequisites for its development existed long before. World War I signaled to the world that submarines had become a formidable force, as evidenced by successful attacks not only on cargo ships but also on warships. One example is the German submarine U-9's attack on an entire squadron, during which the submarine sank 3 British cruisers in a short period of time. However, submarines of that era had a very limited operational range. Submarines had limited fuel and torpedoes, and crews had difficulty remaining at sea for extended periods due to limited provisions and cramped quarters. To increase submarines' range and sea life, they could be resupplied from surface cargo ships, a practice that continued until the 1930s. By this time, the situation had already changed. The Air Force was acquiring increasingly sophisticated aircraft capable of operating over the sea, and the Navy was keeping pace. Sending surface ships on supply missions was already quite risky, as the enemy could now easily intercept them. In 1934, the German Navy proposed supplying submarines with other submarines, only cargo ones, especially since the Germans already had experience with the Deutschland-class submarine blockade runners, large submarines that had supplied Germany with vital cargo during World War I, bypassing port blockades. The initial design envisioned supplying only fuel, meaning it was only a submarine tanker. However, the Navy prioritized the development of surface ships, and the idea was abandoned until the start of World War II. In 1939, the supply submarine project was revived, but now the focus was not only on fuel, but also on other resources. The need for such submarines arose when the Kriegsmarine Command concluded that U-boats, particularly the Type 7, would be unable to intercept ships moving beyond their operational range, which averaged 8,500 nautical miles. To increase this range, the submarines needed to be supplied by other submarines capable of delivering cargo covertly. It also became clear to the Germans that the United States would sooner or later enter the war, meaning German submarines would also need to be capable of operating off the American coast. German designers decided to base the design on the large Type 9D submarine, a long-range ocean-going submarine with a hull lengthened by 11 meters, 36 feet, bringing the overall length of the submarine to 67 meters, 219 feet. The new submarine was designed with a larger overall hull, appearing thicker externally. It had a surface displacement of 1,600 tons, a beam of 9 meters, 29 feet, and a height of 11 meters, 36 feet. No torpedo tubes were installed on this submarine. All available space was dedicated to cargo. Its only armament was anti-aircraft artillery, namely two 37mm anti-aircraft guns and one 20mm anti-aircraft gun. The overall hull design allowed for the carriage of 423 tons of fuel, 4 torpedoes on the outer deck in special containers, and up to 20 tons of food, medicine and other essential supplies. The submarine's pressure hull was designed to dive to a depth of 240 meters, 787 feet. Surface propulsion was provided by two MAN diesel engines producing 3000 horsepower, as well as two Siemens electric motors producing 750 horsepower for submerged propulsion. The submarine achieved a surface speed of 14 knots and a submerged speed of 6 knots. Its cruising range was 12,350 nautical miles at 10 knots, or approximately 22,870 kilometers. The conning tower, periscopes and binoculars were the same as those on Type 9 submarines. The submarine had a refrigerated compartment for food storage and even its own bakery for baking fresh bread. The submarine's crew consisted of 53 submariners but could have included more. Initially, the Germans built 3 submarines as a test version, which plans to order up to 25 submarines. However, only 10 were actually built. Construction began in November 1940 in Kiel, with U-459 being the first submarine in the series. The last 3 submarines were commissioned into the Kriegsmarine in 1943. It should also be noted that other large German submarines also served as milchkuhs, such as the Type 10B mine layers. However, these were not dedicated cargo submarines, but rather converted ones, and their effectiveness in supply operations was limited. The process of transferring resources at sea between two submarines was as follows. A Type 7 or Type 9 submarine at sea would receive an Enigma encrypted message indicating a rendezvous point. The milchkuh would leave its base and proceed to the rendezvous point and time, with all movements kept secret. Once at a designated location, the submarines would meet and approach each other. Then being the transfer of cargo and torpedoes, as well as the transfer of fuel through hoses. The entire cargo transfer process was labor-intensive and lengthy, involving the crews of both submarines. As you can imagine, both submarines were highly vulnerable at this point, especially if enemy aircraft appeared. Therefore, the location and time of the meeting were intended to reduce the likelihood of attack, but more often than not, the submariners simply took risks to obtain the cargo faster. These submarines are considered to have been quite effective. Over the course of their use, more than 430 resupply missions were successful, with U-460 considered the most successful, having completed 86 resupply missions. The Allies quickly learned of the Germans' use of these submarines from their intelligence sources. At sea, these submarines were no less important targets for both ships and aircraft. Naturally, a submarine with such a large and thick hull was far less maneuverable than conventional submarines. The submarine's speed was reduced by several knots, making it more difficult to control both above and below the water, and most importantly, its diving speed was slower, reducing its chances of escaping from destroyers and anti-submarine bombers. All 10 submarines were sunk during World War II, 3 of which sank with all hands. Allied aircraft were the primary cause of all Type 14 sinkings. Only 2 submarines were sunk by destroyers. However, submarines of this class often shoot down or damaged Allied aircraft with their anti-aircraft weapons. For example, U-459 shot down 4 aircraft and damaged 1 Whitley bomber. There were also plans for further developments throughout the project's history. including larger Type 15 and Type 16 submarines, but these were never realized. The last Type 14 submarine, U-409T, was sunk in the Atlantic on June 12, 1944. The submarine was attacked by several American destroyers, suffered damage, surfaced, and surrounded to the Allies. All 60 German submariners were rescued, and the submarine sank. During World War II, the Allies used various interesting devices to help them search for German submarines. One such device was the Leylight system. There is a separate video about it. The link is on the screen or below this video. See you soon!